Hi there! While Minecraft is playing in the background, why not take a quick break and listen to a few stories from Reddit? Today we'll be talking about people who were really pushed to their limits at one point, but instead of just putting up with it, they waited for the right moment and taught their tormentors a lesson they'll never forget. If you love stories like these, get comfortable and let's get started. My former boss betrayed me and left me high and dry, so I made sure he lost the one thing he'd dreamed of his whole life. Where should I start? I guess at the very beginning. In college, I studied computer science. I graduated right before the 2008 financial crisis. Before that, my field was considered the profession of the future. Various companies would come to our college, introduce themselves, and offer scholarships if we signed a contract agreeing to work for them after graduation. After the crisis, those offers vanished immediately. Because of this, I couldn't afford to continue my studies at college, and I had to look for a job, which turned out to be not so easy. For almost the entire period from age 20 to nearly 30, I went through a rough roller coaster ride, bouncing from one dead-end job to another. I'd get a job, save up a little money, and then I'd get laid off shortly afterward, spending my savings on daily expenses while I looked for the next crappy job. The years went by, technology advanced, and I couldn't afford training courses to keep up with it. And then as I approached 30, I gave up. I was fed up. I needed a complete career change. I decided to follow in my late father's footsteps and become a welder. And that's when it seemed as if fate itself stepped in. A week before I applied to change careers, a government program was launched that allowed people to train as welders for free. After I completed the welding courses, I was quickly offered a job doing field work. The offer came within a few days, not months like with my previous job, but days. And that's when the main character enters our story. I'll call him Rat Boss. I'll just call him RB for short. RB ran a small field welding company with half a dozen people on the team. They traveled all over Europe, doing on-site welding. He said he'd take me on, teach me all the ins and outs of how to really weld, not all that school nonsense. And let me tell you, the first 6 years were amazing. Yes, the work was hard, from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. Sometimes we wouldn't be home for over a month, but the travel, the adventures, and the camaraderie were worth it. We started out as complete strangers and became like brothers. Looking back, I miss those days, even though they're behind us now. And RB back then was such a boss that everyone else just paled in comparison. I remember one time when he took out a high-interest loan to pay us for our work because he had an urgent expense that left him with no money in his account. Payment from the client wasn't expected for another couple of weeks. He chose to borrow money to pay us on time rather than ask us to wait a couple of weeks. But everything changed by the 7th year. By then, most of the core team had left, missing their families too much. RB retired. He appointed me foreman while he looked for work back home and began sending me workers after interviewing them first. At first, things weren't going too badly. We successfully completed several projects, but the workers he sent me left a lot to be desired. For many of them, it was just a side gig, a way to make a quick buck, pay off debts, or gain experience to find a job back home. But then the pandemic hit, and I found myself out of work. That wasn't a big problem for me, since I'd been used to saving money for a rainy day since I was young. But that's when it all started. Decent workers no longer wanted to work abroad because of COVID, and the recruitment agency started sending everyone to me indiscriminately. Drunks, thieves, drug addicts, and people who had nothing to lose and no desire to do their jobs well. Things went off the rails pretty quickly. As the foreman, I did everything I could to finish the project, sign the acceptance report, issue an invoice to the clients, and pay the workers. But incidents kept happening outside of work, incidents typical of the demographic group I was working with. And to top it all off, paychecks started arriving late. Travel expenses weren't reimbursed, and that rat of a boss started getting creative with the accounting, juggling pre-tax and post-tax salaries. Once, I even got a call at 3 a.m. It was the client, informing me that one of our guys had been arrested for a drunken disturbance. He didn't have any ID on him, just his work ID. So they called our client in the middle of the night to ask him to help identify this troublemaker. So yeah, I had to go pick him up, but only after I'd listened to a whole bunch of crap directed at me. When I got home, I had a serious talk with RB, told him I was done with this crap and that it was time to set things straight. He apologized half-heartedly, then admitted that he was having problems with his wife, who ran the business with him, and that she was constantly arguing with him about how the money was being spent. At that point, he owed me roughly a year's worth of travel expenses, and considering that I drove at least 2,000 miles a month, that was a considerable amount. He apologetically asked me to hold off on the payment because his wife wouldn't let him spend large sums of money. He also asked me to work for a couple more months at minimum wage until he could put together a proper team. Being the gullible fool that I was, I agreed to his proposal. There was no reason not to trust him. After all, we'd known each other for almost 7 years. And at that point, I thought it was perfectly reasonable to give him time to fix the situation, but with one condition. I needed to receive half of what he owed me by the end of September because I was planning to renovate my house. He said that wouldn't be a problem, since I'd given him advance notice. I said, okay, it's a deal. But I was still on my guard. A few months went by. I was working at an oil company for minimum wage, but the problem was that even that paycheck was coming late. My suspicions began to grow. I was worried that I'd have to put off the home renovations, and it's hard to find professionals for that kind of work. You have to pay a deposit just to book the contractors. In early September, the month he was supposed to pay half the debt, I reached out to him again. He assured me that paying the debt wouldn't be a problem, and that he already had the money. As I was leaving, he gave me the most insincere smile I'd ever seen. I silently gave him a look that even an idiot would have understood meant I wasn't joking anymore. The smile instantly vanished from RB's face. I said goodbye, got in my car, and drove home. That evening, RB sent me a message saying he'd put together a new team and was heading abroad to talk to a potential client and get back out in the field himself. A red flag. He was planning to take off right when he was supposed to pay me what I was owed. He was going to rip me off. He intended to rip me off after everything we'd been through together. That's when I decided that if the money didn't come on time, I'd quit. But when something is weighing on your mind as heavily as RB's potential betrayal, it's impossible to focus on work. And that's when I slipped on the ramp. I didn't just sprain my ankle or tear a ligament. I literally shattered my ankle. This happened a week before his payment was due. I had to undergo emergency surgery. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital and couldn't even put weight on that leg for 6 months. What do you think happened to the money he promised to pay me? It never came. Shocking, isn't it? And that's not all. That month, I didn't even get my paycheck. And the situation was getting even worse. While I was in the hospital on strong painkillers, renovations began at my house. My mom, who had access to my account, used my savings to pay for the home improvements instead of canceling them. So I'm almost out of money. She told me not to worry because I'd be 100% reimbursed for my sick leave. I wasn't so sure. Here's how sick leave works in my country. In the case of a work-related injury requiring a recovery period of more than a month, the employer is only required to pay for the first month of sick leave, while the government covers the rest. The employer pays Social Security contributions and taxes. The government reimburses the employer for the sick leave, and the employer in turn transfers the sick leave pay to the employee. And RB didn't transfer my sick pay to me. I didn't receive a single kopeck from them at all. That's how I ended up broken and crippled in bed, unable to work. And things just kept getting worse. I spent all my savings to pay off my debts. The banks called me every week. I had to sell my investments to pay off my debts and support myself while I was recovering. These were investments that would have provided me with a modest but stable income after I retired, so I was ready for retirement. He lied to me, hid from me, didn't pay back what he owed, stole from me, and embezzled money that was supposed to come from the government. He'll burn in hell for everything he's done. Revenge. Before I tell you how I got my revenge on that rat of a boss, I want to tell you a little about him. He lived in a small apartment in our capital city with his wife and 2 children. The apartment was extremely small, so tiny that they literally had to crawl over each other to get past one another. But he had a dream. He bought a plot of land on which he was building a large house, so large that just one of the rooms would be bigger than his entire apartment. Over the past 7 years, he'd been building it brick by brick, and he was almost finished. When we were still talking, he told me he had at most 6 months left before he could move in. The thing is, a foreman's job involves a ton of paperwork. Every decision, every purchase, every dirty little secret hidden in the numbers. And I had it all. All that was left was to submit all this data to the relevant authorities. As soon as I was able to get back on my feet, though stand up is of course a bit of an exaggeration, it was more like hobbling along on my recovering leg under the influence of powerful painkillers. I set out to submit it to every government agency that could possibly get its hands on it. The biggest blow came from the Ministry of Labor. An inspector went through all the evidence I'd provided and muttered to herself, her eyes wide open. My God, he's violated half of our country's labor laws. The consequences. I live in a country that could be called a second world country. Our government is slow and inefficient, but it takes action when pushed. And when it took on the case of the rat boss, his business collapsed harder than the meteorite that killed the dinosaurs. His accounts were frozen. He was barred from traveling abroad. His business license was revoked, and he was ordered to lay off all his current employees with severance pay, money he didn't have. Shortly thereafter, he filed for bankruptcy. He had to sell the house he dreamed of his whole life to cover the fines. Now he's stuck, just like me. But he's worse off. He's trapped in that sardine can of his, unable to work, unable to support his family, unable to pay his bills until the legal proceedings with the government are over. I managed to stay afloat after what he did to me, but after what I did to him, he lost everything. I reduced him to absolute poverty. When the government really got its hands on him, he called me. I'll spare you the exact dialogue because this post is already too long. But to sum it up, he was yelling into the phone about how I could have done that to him and cursing me out. In response, I accused him of cheating me out of money after 7 years of friendship, leaving me to die in the hospital, called him a rat who betrayed a friend, and told him never to call me again. Since we're now in a legal dispute, he has to route all communications through the labor inspection office. Then he hung up. I filed a lawsuit after he'd already declared bankruptcy. Once he paid all the fines, all I was able to get from him was payment for 1 month of sick leave. No travel expenses, no salary, nothing. But I'll get through all this somehow. The main thing is that he's facing 10 times as many problems. This isn't a case of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Here, it's a whole face for an eye and a whole head for a tooth. Damn it, I'm still getting back on my feet, both literally and figuratively. And that rat is wallowing in the mud. He used to dream of his big house, but now he dreams of getting out of all this shit just so he can start all over again. My fiancée left me after I told her I had cancer. In the end, I left her with nothing. 4 years have passed since then. The pain has subsided, and I've gotten my comeuppance. I apologize if this isn't quite the right place for a story like this. We'd been dating for 4 years, and I thought we had a wonderful relationship. We both had great careers. We each had our own homes. We lived in the same neighborhood, and we both had daughters. When we met, her daughter was 11 and mine was 16. We were planning to get married, build a house, and raise our daughters together. We planned to build the house with the understanding that she had recently been diagnosed with a neurological condition that would eventually confine her to a wheelchair. So the house had to be designed accordingly. While the design was underway, I started landscaping her property and doing renovations to increase the value of her home when it came time to sell. In total, I invested about $30,000, channeling everything through my construction business for tax purposes, permits, and future resale. We agreed that payment for the work would be made after the house was sold. I issued an invoice for each job, but I didn't rush her to pay, since that was the agreement. 6 months later, when we were already looking at a building lot and finalizing the blueprints, I started feeling unwell. I couldn't eat, I was constantly nauseous, vomiting, and bleeding. My stomach was bloated, which was strange. After all, we were eating right and going to the gym every day. I went to the doctor and we began a series of tests. At the same time, she started having problems with her memory and concentration. The disease was progressing, and the stress from work was only making her condition worse. She agreed to switch to a less demanding position at the same company and take a pay cut of $20,000 a year. After a month of various tests and a biopsy, the doctor told me that I had a tumor in my stomach the size of a golf ball, and that I needed to start chemotherapy. So I began a course of radiation therapy, and as you might expect, I felt terrible. She spent her weekends with me, helped out around the house, and stayed overnight. In the end, she and her daughter were at my place more often than at their own. That's when I suggested we sell one of our houses and live together until the new one was ready. I had excellent supplemental insurance and a long-term illness support program. So, by combining that with the money from selling the house, we could easily make ends meet and ease her financial burden a little. Shortly after that conversation, she suddenly became distant. Her daughter stopped coming over and interacting with mine. She always had excuses for not meeting up. She stopped driving me to my medical appointments and no longer stayed overnight. And then she said something that has been etched in my memory forever. I love you, but I can't imagine caring for a seriously ill person for many years. I don't think we should see each other anymore. She said this in a text message. That broke me completely. I won't lie. She was the first woman with whom I decided to rebuild my life after my wife's death, when my children were just 1 and 3 years old. But I tried to maintain my dignity, forced myself to understand her position, and accept what I couldn't change. The next day, I calmly gathered all her things, packed them neatly, loaded them into the car, and drove them to her house to leave them on the back porch while she was at work, just to avoid an awkward encounter. I walked around the house, set the box under the awning, and saw her in the living room. She was fooling around with a man she'd previously introduced to me as an old friend. We used to have dinner and drinks together. I knew his girlfriend. The 4 of us even went on vacation together. I didn't say anything to her about it. Later, I simply sent her a message saying I'd left her things on the porch. She could pick them up whenever she had time. About 8 or 9 months later, that friend's ex-girlfriend told me that they'd broken up because he'd confessed that he and my fiancé had been having an affair, which had started around the time we were finishing the blueprints for our new house. That's when I really lost it. It was time for revenge. By that point, I'd finished my course of chemotherapy and radiation and was feeling much better. While sorting through papers I hadn't had the energy to deal with in a long time, I stumbled upon a folder containing unpaid renovation bills totaling $32,680. They were nearly 2 years overdue. I immediately handed everything over to a lawyer to begin the process of placing a lien on her house. And as it turned out, it was perfect timing. She was just about to put the house up for sale. Taking into account the interest accrued over the 19 months she was in default, the total amount had grown to a staggering sum. In the end, after the house was sold, the mortgage was paid off, and her debts and legal fees were settled. She was left with about $10,000. She had to give up on buying a new house and move in with her eldest daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. She also quit her job and went on disability benefits. About a year ago, I happened to run into her. She looked like she had aged 20 years and was already in the wheelchair we had once talked about. We exchanged a few polite words. I said goodbye and went on my way. A few days later, her younger daughter called and said she had heard about our meeting and asked, "Would you like to get together sometime?" I gave a vague answer, thanked her for the call, and went on with my life. A week later, my ex called herself and started apologizing for the way everything had happened. I was polite but brief. I thanked her for the call and hung up. Then she started sending me messages. This went on for several weeks until one day she asked if I could even imagine us getting back together. I replied, "I can't imagine taking care of a seriously ill person for many years. Remember the box on your porch? Did you think your old friend took it from my house and brought it to you? Good luck. Goodbye." Sometimes I feel guilty about what happened, but only a little, and very rarely. So this woman knew she would soon end up in a wheelchair, and she had a man who was ready to support her and take care of her. He was even planning to build a house designed around her condition, yet she left him for a guy who was cheating on his own girlfriend. You really have to be incredibly short-sighted and foolish. How quickly is her illness progressing? Is there a chance she'll die prematurely? She's now in her late 40s. Over the course of about 8 years, the disease turned her from someone who loved running marathons into someone confined to a wheelchair. Her current prognosis is unknown to me. If you cheat on your wife with mine, I'll burn your life to the ground. Back in the early 2000s, I began to suspect that my wife was up to something. Our kids were about 4 and 6 years old. They were still little, but they could already tell me how their day had gone. They mentioned more and more often that they were spending their days at her parents' house. That in itself didn't seem strange, but her parents lived about an hour and a half away, so going there 2 or 3 times a week was way too often. But in reality, she was doing it every day she wasn't working her side job. When I asked her about it, she denied everything. The thing is, she was never very good at lying. So I started keeping track of the mileage on her car and noticed she was racking up about 700 kilometers extra per week. It was immediately clear that something was up. One day, I sat down at the computer and saw a sticker with her AOL password next to the keyboard. I couldn't resist. I logged into her email and stumbled upon a conversation between her and her best friend from college. The emails revealed that my wife was regularly sleeping with one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. There were almost no details about him, just insults directed at his wife and mocking jabs about how she'd put on weight after giving birth. I printed out these emails and hid the copies, but I needed more details, so I called a friend who's a police officer, and he advised me to contact an acquaintance of his who had left the force and become a private investigator. Ron turned out to be an excellent professional. I paid him in advance, gave him the correspondence, and everything I knew about my wife's movements, and he found out what she was up to. His report, complete with photographs and specific times, dates, and locations, described in detail how she would leave the children with her parents. Then she would meet this man for lunch. Afterward, they'd head to a seedy motel for a couple of hours, and then she'd pick up the kids and come back home. After that, I hired a lawyer to file for divorce. My parents had cheated on each other, and the consequences of that mess ruined my childhood and that of my brothers and sisters. For me, that was unacceptable. I also asked Ron to find out everything he could about that guy. Ron didn't let me down. I found out his name was Bob, that he was married with 3 kids, and that he worked as vice president of sales at his father-in-law's company. At that moment, I instructed my lawyer to prepare the divorce papers. I asked Ron to make a couple more copies of the report and to fulfill one last request of mine. On the very same day that my wife was served with the divorce papers right at work, I asked Ron to meet with Bob's wife and show her everything he'd uncovered. She struck me as a decent woman, and I believed she had a right to know what her husband was up to. What she decided to do with that information was her own business. Although the evidence of my wife's infidelity had little impact on my own divorce proceedings, Bob's wife really tore him apart. According to court records and related documents available to the public, she emptied their joint account, took the children, and left. As soon as her father found out what had happened, Bob was fired. Furthermore, the house where they lived belonged to his wife's parents, and he was evicted. Their divorce proceedings turned ugly. There were many arguments, both in court and outside of it. Rumor has it that Bob went to his wife's house and started a fight, after which her brother intervened and broke Bob's nose. This was followed by restraining orders, new police reports, criminal charges, and even a prison sentence. Right now, I can't find any information about Bob online. The last I heard, he left the state. His ex-wife is doing pretty well. She got a job at her father's company and eventually took his place after he retired. As for me, my ex-wife and I maintained a fairly cordial relationship, communicating only about matters concerning the kids. And now that they've grown up, we don't talk at all. I don't hate her. She's important to me only as the mother of my children, and nothing more. That's pretty well put. Although I don't understand how you can be angrier at that guy than at your own wife. Don't get me wrong. Of course, I was angry at my wife too. During the divorce proceedings, I did everything I could to make her suffer. For example, she wanted to try couples therapy, and I agreed, not because I saw a chance for reconciliation, but because it felt good to vent everything I was feeling because of what she'd done, how disgusted I was, how disappointed and angry I was. After every session, she'd come out in tears and then sit in the car for a long time, sobbing, before pulling herself together. Eventually, she realized that it was all over between us and canceled the remaining sessions. I also had to think about what would be best for the kids. I didn't want to repeat the chaos I'd gone through myself, seeing my parents yell at each other, my father calling my mother a whore, and using even worse words. On the contrary, it was better for the kids if everything went as smoothly as possible. I've never told them the details of what happened between me and their mom, and I probably never will. I don't know what she told them, but I still have Ron's report tucked away, just in case I ever have to lay the truth out for them. And I was angry at Bob, not for my own sake, but on behalf of his wife. I believed she had the right to at least know what was going on. What she did with that information was up to her. The consequences for Bob didn't come because of me, but because of his wife's anger and, most likely, her father's. After what he'd done, I merely held a match to the wick. Karen really got the short end of the stick. A few years ago, I got a job at a large industrial plant. I was lucky. My boss turned out to be Joe, a great manager. The work was tough, 12 hours a day, 13 days in a row, then 1 day off on Sunday, and then another 13 days of work. I was young. It didn't bother me. On the contrary, that kind of work helped my wife and me save up for a house. After about half a year, Joe noticed that I was picking up the work quickly and promoted me to foreman. That meant a raise and more responsibility, the kind of thing most workers preferred to stay away from. Joe usually sent me to the problem areas in his department, and my job was to sort out the messes and streamline the processes. It was a unionized workplace, and the people there had a laid-back attitude. There was no point in working harder or doing better quality work. Just work your hours and don't screw up the process. That was the unspoken rule. A few years later, Joe was promoted to manager, and he took me with him to his new department. Technically, I wasn't a supervisor yet, but in practice, I was performing those duties. The actual supervisors liked that. They didn't have to leave the office, and I was happy too. It was a great experience for me. In the end, I earned a good reputation and respect among both the workers and management. Over time, Joe's work areas began to show such good results that he was promoted to plant director. As before, he wanted to promote me as well, this time officially to supervisor. We discussed this at length because the only open position was under Karen's supervision. Karen was a member of a minority group and part of the LGBTQ+ community. She was literally the face of the company when it came to inclusivity. Her photo was featured on the website in that section. At the same time, she had only recently become a manager, and Joe didn't have much faith in her leadership abilities. But I was full of enthusiasm and in high spirits. Yeah, we'll figure it all out now. I decided to take a chance and agreed. I had to go through an interview with Karen. At the same time, I met her supervisors. They were quiet and rather reserved people. After the promotion, I started working alongside another supervisor, Chris. He was young, already had a small child, and his wife was pregnant and staying home. The first week went smoothly. I got to know the staff, familiarized myself with the processes, and settled into my new role. During the second week, Chris's wife went into labor, and it was a difficult experience. He went on paternity leave for 6 weeks, and I was simply thrown into the deep end, left to handle the entire department, which had about 60 employees, all by myself. I was barely keeping up, but I tried my hardest. Whenever I turned to Karen for help or advice, she would just brush me off contemptuously and say, "If I have to do your job myself, then what good are you to me?" In the end, I gritted my teeth and worked non-stop. My wife gave me a smartwatch, and it showed that I was averaging 25,000 steps a day, just to keep everything afloat somehow. We did the best we could, and the employees tried to help too, because the situation was tough for everyone. A couple of weeks later, while reviewing quality documents, I noticed that one of the quality control steps wasn't being performed at all. I sent the information to the quality engineers, and they were absolutely stunned. We were completely skipping an entire 4-hour operation within a 20-hour production cycle. It turned out that one of the reasons Karen had been promoted was that her department had shown outstanding efficiency. And then it came to light that she herself had decided to eliminate that quality control step, thereby saving about 20% of the time. The problem was that the engineers hadn't approved this, and as a result, a huge scramble ensued to fix the consequences. The process had to be urgently brought back on track, and the warranty had to be extended for parts that didn't pass inspection. The company found itself in an awkward position, and Karen was cast in an extremely negative light. Against this backdrop, she became even more vindictive and toxic. She openly claimed that she would never be fired, and that she could do whatever she wanted. She would go around the departments, and if she didn't like someone, she would force the supervisors to file a disciplinary report against that person by the end of the day. They had to find a reason. And if we didn't do that, she'd take it out on us. For example, she'd make us stay after our shift for some pointless task like taking inventory, simply because she could. She wouldn't let supervisors make any decisions without her approval. Even things like working overtime had to be coordinated with her. And she'd drag out her response until the end of the day, which left the departments in a bind. Then, if there weren't enough people to cover the overtime, she'd blame us for it. We knew it wasn't right, but everyone needed a job, so we did our best, both for her sake and for the sake of the staff. Basically, we were like clowns at a rodeo, and she was that very same raging bull. On the very first day Chris returned, both of us were called into Karen's office. She started lashing out at me, saying that I wasn't doing my job well, that I was setting her up, and that I never asked her for help. I was simply speechless, especially considering that she herself had previously said that a supervisor's responsibilities were below her level. After the meeting, I was in shock, but I realized pretty quickly that she was simply going to squeeze me out of the company, and this was just the beginning. I called Joe and asked to meet with him urgently that same day. When we met, I told him everything that had been going on, the pressure, the abuse, her behavior. The irony is that while I was talking to him, another supervisor called him with the exact same complaints about Karen. Joe was shocked and said he'd talk to her. At the same time, he gave me complete freedom to move to any open position in the company starting the very next day. He clearly didn't want to lose me. In the end, I transferred to another department to work in engineering and IT, and I thought that would be the end of it. A few weeks later, as I was leaving work, Karen suddenly noticed that I hadn't returned my laptop and phone to her. I replied that I hadn't realized that, but I could bring everything in the next day. She smirked and said they'd get them back soon anyway. I didn't think much of it at the time. About 6 months later, I had a performance review with my new boss, Jake. Everything went great. He was very pleased with my work and was even surprised at how quickly I'd gotten the hang of everything. At the end of the meeting, he casually mentioned that Karen had tried to interfere with my performance review and get me fired, but Joe put a stop to it. "Well, that's it, Karen. You've really pushed me over the edge." After I left her department, there was a frenzied turnover of staff. Supervisors were quitting about once every 3 months, and this despite the fact that it was a family-owned company. Entire generations, fathers, mothers, and children, worked there. In some departments, 3 generations of the same family worked side by side. And yet Karen was simply grinding down employees and managers like a steamroller. Working under her leadership had effectively become a death sentence. I once casually mentioned the turnover to Joe, and he said he couldn't understand what was going on. People were quitting without warning. No exit interviews were being conducted. I explained that Karen was simply driving people out by issuing disciplinary actions, and when they handed in their resignation letters or 2-week notices, she'd fire them on the spot and throw the letter away. Then she'd tell HR that the person had resigned on the spot, and that was it. Joe said that because of her status and position in the company, nothing would be done against her until there was ironclad evidence, so I decided to take care of it. After work, I started meeting regularly with the supervisors from her department. We'd go out for drinks together and chat. I kept my finger on the pulse. If anyone was planning to quit, I made sure they mailed their resignation letter to Karen with a copy to Joe and HR, went through an exit interview, and, just in case, called the corporate ethics hotline. Everything was going according to plan, and all the supervisors were on my side, except for Chris. He really needed this job, and Karen left him alone. By a lucky coincidence, I found out that she was simply underreporting his bonuses to save money, which is why she wasn't pushing him too hard. When I told Chris about this, he was furious and wanted to quit right away, but I advised him to talk to Joe first. Their conversation went well, and Chris decided to stay. After that, we had the full support of all the supervisors. Joe invited a senior HR manager from headquarters in Kansas, and over the course of a week, each supervisor was called in one by one for confidential interviews so that Karen wouldn't suspect anything. By the end, they had letters, messages, witnesses, a mountain of evidence. I know the rest of the story from what others, Icar, Joe, and so on, have told me. Despite all this, the company wanted to sweep the situation under the rug, so they called Karen in and offered her a very generous severance package to leave. But she, as usual, got worked up, started threatening to sue for discrimination, and even hired a lawyer. A few months later, Karen found a new job as a plant manager at another company, and I found out exactly where. I casually mentioned to our union representatives where she was now working and suggested they contact the union at that plant. She was fired 3 months later for harassing employees. The last I heard, she had to sell her house and move to another state in search of work. Never piss off a rich redneck. My wicked stepmother gave away my PlayStation 4 while I was away at college. I decided to get back at her, and when she left on her honeymoon with her new husband, I rented out her house. I'm an only child. My mom died of ovarian cancer 5 years ago. She was only 55. It broke my father's heart. They'd been together since college. They were the same age. My father was a month older. At the time of the main events in this story, I was 22 years old and about to graduate from college with a degree in chemistry. I was studying on a full scholarship. This detail will be important later on. My father met my current stepmother when she was a nurse at the hospital where my mother spent her final days. My stepmother, let's call her Grace, pulled all the right strings to win my father's trust. She showed empathy and concern, comforting him after my mother's death. I was 17 at the time. I was old enough to understand. She just wanted to gain his trust and get access to my father's money, but it was his decision whether or not to enter into a relationship with her. I was finishing my senior year of high school and had just received a scholarship to study abroad. My father mourned my mother for a whole year, and during that entire time, Grace called him every couple of months. I think she was just testing how deeply she could get under his skin. After a year, she stopped pretending to be a caring friend of the family and went on the offensive. When they started dating, Grace was only 40. I didn't like her, but at least my dad stopped being so depressed, so I decided not to be such a pessimist and give her a chance. Although deep down, I certainly didn't trust her. However, we're Scandinavians, and in our family, a son doesn't tell his father what to do or even voice his opinion. By the way, Grace was from the Czech Republic. My father was a very successful banker and had amassed a substantial fortune. Without going into details, 6 months after their romance began, he and Grace got married. But my father never fully recovered from my mother's death. He grew weaker and weaker, even though he was only 57. When his health began to decline, he called me over and asked me straight out, "Son, what do you need to get settled in life?" I told him I didn't need anything. "I'm a man, and I'll take care of myself. Besides, Dad, what are you talking about? You've got a long life ahead of you." I reminded him that he still had sisters with children, my aunts and cousins, and I added that I was studying for free, so he didn't need to worry about money for me. He died just a year later, at age 59. Of course, having watched so many Hollywood movies, I briefly wondered if his new wife, a nurse, had poisoned him and forced him to sign his entire estate over to her. But, to be honest, I don't believe that. Other relatives didn't like Grace either, but they knew that my father was madly in love with my mother and that her death simply devastated him. In short, my father left me his 5-bedroom house in his will. I didn't expect it, and I didn't ask for it. He left small amounts to each of his sisters and their children. My father gave about 80% of his entire fortune to Grace. That was hundreds of thousands of dollars. I got something too, a few tens of thousands. And, of course, that money came in very handy. Grace tried to pretend that everything was fine, but I could clearly see how angry she was that the house hadn't gone to her. It belonged to me, and I had all the documents for it. What infuriated her most was that we lived in a very prestigious neighborhood where it's extremely difficult to buy a house, and they cost a fortune. For the first few months after my father's death, I had this disgusting, vile feeling. It was as if Grace was testing the waters to see if I might want, let's say, a relationship with her. Ugh, what a disgusting thought. Nevertheless, she continued to live in the house because she'd grown accustomed to it over the past 3 years and acted like the owner there, even though, legally, the house belonged to me. I was in college full-time and only stopped by once every couple of months. And even then, not to see her, but to visit my cousins who lived nearby. I never reminded her that it was actually my house, and over time it seems Grace simply forgot that legally she had no claim to it. It looks like she decided that since I wasn't demanding a single cent from her out of the hundreds of thousands my father had left behind, that meant I was well off myself and would eventually just hand the house over to her. However, I realized that sooner or later I'd deal this bitch a little nuclear blow. This realization hit me the moment she started dating some new guy just 5 months after my father's funeral. One day, when I came home after graduating from college, she and her new boyfriend, some slick guy named Ivan, just a couple of years older than me, were acting as if I were a stranger in my own home, and they were the ones in charge. I decided to play along for the time being. Grace claimed she'd given my PlayStation 4 to Ivan's cousin because I was too old to play video games. So you gave my console to some jerk I don't even know so he could pass it on to another jerk I don't know either. That same day, I changed all the passwords on my accounts. I smiled, but I already knew exactly what to do next. Then she told me that she and Ivan were going to get married because I couldn't spend forever mourning my father. I needed to move on. And I told her that I'd finished college, had already found a job at a local firm, and would soon be finding a new place to live. She practically beamed, especially when I mentioned the new place, and then, with feigned concern, added, "But remember, you'll always have a place in our home. You can come visit whenever you want." "Thank you, Grace. That's so generous of you." I replied that I'd most likely be moving to my new place in 3 months. She was even happier, precisely because she was planning to go back to her home country to get married to Ivan and then go on their honeymoon. She clarified that the wedding would be in the local style. "Otherwise, I would have invited you, dear. And anyway, I know you're busy." I congratulated her, and she asked me to keep an eye on the house. Keep an eye on my own house? No problem. I agreed, of course, but I chose my words carefully. I never once said your house. As soon as they left with that stepson of hers who'd clearly decided to marry Grace just for her money, I immediately posted a rental ad, hired movers, packed up all of Grace's belongings, including the furniture, and sent them to a storage facility. I left my parents' furniture, which had been there even before she moved in. I replaced all the locks. Within a couple of days, the inquiries started pouring in. The house, with its excellent furniture and gorgeous view, was in crazy demand. In the end, I rented it out to a wonderful family, a lawyer and his wife, a teacher, and their 2 teenage children. They paid the first few months' rent in advance and signed a 1-year lease. I warned them that my crazy stepmother, who considers this house her own, might show up, and I gave them the contact information for my lawyer, the same one who used to work with my father, so they could confirm that everything was completely legal. I also gave my lawyer the details about the storage unit, including the fact that I'd generously paid for 4 months of storage in advance, a whole month longer than Grace's honeymoon in the Czech Republic would last. Next, I found a great apartment in the city, close to my new job. And at one of the restaurants I go to in the evenings after a hard day, I met a woman. We've been dating for 6 months now and are engaged. Grace, of course, screamed and threw a fit when she realized she'd been kicked out of my house. But my lawyer quickly shut her up, and I never had to see her ugly mug again. Rumor has it that she and her scumbag husband have left the country. I suppose they're squandering my dad's money and will soon be penniless, as is usually the case with those who've gotten a taste of the good life. So maybe Grace will try to fleece some other lonely guy. As for money, the house I rent out brings in so much profit that not only do I help pay for my cousin's education, but I've also moved into a bigger apartment with my fiancé. I love my job, but to be honest, I could live off the income from renting out my father's house alone. And just think, if Grace had been a little more level-headed and decent, I might have just let her stay in the house for the sake of appearances. Well, definitely if she'd stayed away from my room. But no, she acted like she owned the place, and as a wedding gift I had to make her homeless. According to the script, I bought a new curling iron, even though I didn't really use the old one that much. That doesn't matter. She had no right to give away my console. You can't give away other people's things, only your own. That's exactly why I kicked Grace out of my house, because it's my house, and it's my prerogative to decide who gets to stay there. My grandmother put greedy preachers in their place twice, even after her death. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible church her entire adult life. Let's call it Big White Church. This church was part of a major evangelical denomination and was located in an affluent suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt in the southern United States. My grandmother was very active in the life of Big White Church. Every Sunday morning, she volunteered in the children's room, helped prepare hundreds of church breakfasts and dinners, and traveled with her children and grandchildren on dozens of church outings and choir tours. On Sundays, she led Bible studies for teenagers, participated in domestic mission programs, and helped with other youth projects. She always faithfully tithed and often gave beyond that for missions or special fundraisers. Her greatest gift was her ability to make other people feel valued. I saw this with my own eyes more than once. Although I attended a different church myself, I often visited my grandmother and went with her to Big White Church events. I saw her single-handedly prepare breakfast for dozens of teenagers, a task that took over 2 hours, even in a large church kitchen. And then, after the meal, she would ask everyone to applaud the high school senior who had done such a great job organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember how, on one youth trip to a camp outside the city, my grandmother drove back to the city almost all night just to pick up a box of Bible materials that one of the pastor's assistants, let's call him the jerk pastor, had forgotten, and asked her to bring to the morning program. His boss, the senior pastor, let's call him the pompous pastor, never found out that the jerk pastor had messed up, and my grandmother fixed everything for him. The clueless pastor didn't even thank her. I was still a child back then, but even I was so upset by this that I asked my grandmother about the situation. She said it didn't bother her in the least. Her reward was knowing that these materials would help children find Jesus. My grandmother's ministry at the church came to an abrupt end. At age 73, she broke her back in a car accident. For the last 10 years of her life, she was confined to her home. Her health was deteriorating, and she could no longer go to church. Her mind remained clear, her faith strong, but her body grew weaker with each passing day. During those years, she tried many times to reconnect with the church, its leadership, and her old friends in the congregation, inviting them to her home. But all these invitations were either declined or simply ignored. Toward the end of her life, when Grandma was already receiving hospice care at home, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and Grandpa called the church and asked for the senior pastor, that pompous one she'd known for over 30 years, to come see her. They wanted to discuss her memorial service, which they planned to hold at that very church. The pompous pastor turned out to be too busy, but a few days later, a jerk of a pastor stopped by. According to Grandpa, the following happened during that meeting, when Grandma was literally on her deathbed. Grandma, Grandpa, and the jerk of a pastor discussed the funeral for a couple of minutes, and then the jerk of a pastor started trying to persuade her to start storing up treasures in heaven by including his church in her will. Grandpa firmly said, "Now is not the time or place to discuss her will." They returned to the conversation about the funeral, but after a couple of minutes, the jerk of a pastor steered the conversation back to the will, generously adding remarks about how much his church needed her support. Grandpa repeated several times that talking to his dying wife about her will or the church's needs was completely unacceptable, given her condition and pain. The jerk of a pastor seemed to agree, briefly returning to the topic of the funeral, but time and again steered the conversation back to money, heavenly rewards, and quotes like, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," from Matthew 6:21, Luke 12:34, and so on. And then Grandma burst into tears. To be clear, Grandma wasn't just a steel magnolia. She was a titan, encrusted with diamonds and clad in a suit of armor. She almost never cried, and she certainly never shed a single tear for herself when the doctor told her that her fracture was so severe that she would never be able to walk again for the next 6 months without successful rehabilitation. She might shed sincere but restrained tears at a funeral or in the hospital when visiting relatives who were receiving bad news. She cried to support others. Weep with those who weep. But no one, not her grandfather, not her daughter, my mom, not her uncles, nor her grandmother's brothers and sisters, could remember her ever crying for herself. But on that day, she was sobbing uncontrollably. My grandfather, a former ship's cook, a Marine sergeant, and a Korean War veteran, grabbed that jerk of a pastor by the scruff of the neck and threw him out of the house, to put it mildly, not very delicately. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, essentially thanks to her sheer willpower alone. But in the end, she passed away, and her memorial service was held at the funeral home rather than at Big White Church. The pompous pastor and the jerk pastor were, of course, absent. What's more, not a single professional Christian from Big White Church showed up, not even just to sit in the hall. Grandpa opened the service. He stepped up to the pulpit and said, "Some of you may have heard that I didn't invite the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor to this service. Now is neither the time nor the place to explain the reasons for this decision, although you all know me and know that I had good reasons. And most importantly, my wife herself asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from those you've attended before. It will be an open mic service. Anyone who wishes to may come up here and share a story about their friendship with my wife, recall a memorable story about her, or say anything else that will honor her and bring comfort to everyone present. I've asked a few family members to prepare remarks, but it's by no means necessary to prepare anything in advance. Please, if you'd like to say something, come up and speak. There were about 100 people at the service, and at least a third of them eventually came up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last half an hour, went on for over 2 hours, and as far as I could tell, no one left early. There was laughter, tears, and hugs. Her 3 grandchildren played her favorite tunes on the piano and guitar, and we all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns together. Afterward, dozens of people told Grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and inspiring funerals they'd ever attended. Many remarked, "Funerals really do go better without pastors or anything like that." The mention of the pastors and her church in the will was a double blow. A couple of weeks later, it was time to carry out Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa loved each other very much, they had separate wills because, as Grandma told my mom, it was easier that way to respect each other's boundaries. Besides, their lawyer had recommended they do so. No one thought they had a lot of money. For over 50 years, they'd lived in the same small but cozy house in a quiet suburb, worked their whole lives, and lived modestly. But there were rumors that they had quite substantial savings. Of course, there's no legal requirement to read a will aloud. And anyway, in this day and age, with near universal literacy and means of communication, this old-fashioned tradition has all but disappeared. But in our family, reading the will was a tradition, an occasion for everyone to get together. We never had family reunions. It was too difficult to organize something like that for such a large family, but we would get together for birthdays, holidays, funerals, christenings, and other events. So, by attending a few of these events, you could meet almost all your cousins, aunts, uncles, and even second-degree grandparents, as well as your grandparents' brothers and sisters and their spouses. Given this tradition, wills often included very personal bequests of items with almost no monetary value. It was a way to pass on a little piece of one's memory to loved ones once more. And to make absolutely sure no one missed this event, rumors were actively circulating in the family, fueled by Grandpa, that Grandma's will contained a few surprises. The reading took place in the conference room of a law firm. As expected, my mom, my aunts, my cousins, and many of my grandparents' grandchildren were gathered there. But we were all surprised to see a pompous pastor and a jerk of a pastor from Big White Church there. They claimed that my grandmother's lawyer had informed them that her will included not only a donation to the church itself, but also personal bequests for them. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins, and I saw those preachers literally licking their lips at the thought of how generous Grandma had been to them. Grandma had a large family, so there were quite a few beneficiaries named in the will. The conference room was smaller than a typical middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought into the room. All the seats were taken, and the remaining people stood, filling every available space. There were barely enough seats for everyone. Grandma's lawyer suggested that the pompous pastor and the obnoxious pastor sit in the front chairs next to him. Because of the large table, they ended up being the only ones sitting facing everyone else. The preachers, of course, were pleased to be the center of attention, but they didn't notice what everyone else picked up on right away. Those seats allowed us to keep a close eye on them, and at the same time, made it practically impossible for them to leave before the end of the session. After all, there were nearly 20 people, some sitting, some standing, blocking the path to the only door between them and the exit. The wills turned out to be generous, but generally predictable. Grandfather received the house, its contents, pension accounts, and everything that remained after the bequests were fulfilled. The children, grandchildren, and several local charities received substantial sums, though nothing extravagant. The will also mentioned some keepsakes bequeathed to friends and relatives. Grandpa was the first heir on the list. After him, the bequests were arranged in order of increasing value. First came sentimental items with no monetary value, then several $1,000s for each grandchild, followed by slightly larger amounts for the sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, nephews, and nieces. After that, generous sums went to local charities and nonprofit foundations. The bequests to Big White Church, the pompous pastor, and the jerk of a pastor were near the very bottom of the list. They listened politely to the rest of the provisions, but with growing impatience, keenly noting that each subsequent bequest became increasingly generous. And when the lawyer got to the section concerning Big White Church and the preachers, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I read the will in favor of Big White Church, the pompous pastor, and the jerk pastor, Mrs. asked me to read the following message to everyone present." He unfolded a letter written in Grandma's handwriting. Over the past 10 years, not a single person from Big White Church has ever called me, visited me, or sent me a note to say they cared. Not a single minister, not a single deacon, not a single woman from the church, not a single parishioner with whom I worked for so many years, people I loved dearly and considered my friends. I served you faithfully for many years when you needed me. And when I needed your attention and support, you all pretended I didn't exist. You visited me only once, when I was dying, and invited a pompous pastor to come to my home to help plan the funeral. This was my last attempt, after many previous ones over the past 10 years, to mend my relationship with my church and pastor, whom I still loved dearly, even though they had clearly shown that they did not love me. If my funeral had been held at the church, perhaps some of my church friends, whom I hadn't seen in 10 years, would have come to the sanctuary to say goodbye to me one last time. I knew they liked listening to the pompous pastor's sermons, and if he had preached at my funeral, maybe they would have come to hear him, even if they didn't come to see me. But the pompous pastor didn't find the time to visit me, and didn't even call to say whether he was willing to preach at my funeral. That jerk of a pastor stopped by to see me, but he didn't want to talk about the funeral. He just asked, "Remember our church in your will." That's it. Just remember our church in your will. That's when I realized that, once again, I'd let my church break my heart. But this was the last time, the very last time. The foolish pastor didn't know this when he came. But Grandpa and I had already drawn up my will long before his visit, in which a double tithe was stipulated, that is, 20% of all my assets, in favor of my former church, Big White Church. This amount, as specified, was a huge pile of money that elicited a restrained wow from many of the heirs, including me. But I felt it wouldn't be right not to set aside something personally for such good people as the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor. So I amended my will and included them by name. At the same time, I increased the amount left to Big White Church so that it would reflect all the love they had shown me during the last 10 years of my life when I was suffering and lonely and could no longer work for them for free, as I had done for nearly half a century. "That's her entire written statement," said the lawyer. "Now let's get back to the wills. I bequeath 1 cent to the jerk pastor. I bequeath 1 cent to the pompous pastor. I bequeath 1 cent to Big White Church." The pompous pastor and the jerk pastor sat there as if someone had just pumped a gallon of cane into their jaws. At that moment, Grandma's entire family and friends felt a wild urge to burst out laughing. But we held back because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't done yet. She was just setting the stage for a knockout 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss a thing. "There's one more will," the lawyer continued, "in favor of a charitable organization. He named it, but I'll call it Black Charity." Then he paused before announcing the amount. Most of us had no idea what kind of organization it was, but judging by the expressions on the faces of the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor, you could tell right away that they knew Black Charity very well. Their faces reflected the same shock, horror, and panic as if the lawyer had said this money was bequeathed by a demonic baby eater to buy giant barbecue grills and a mountain of charcoal. Now all eyes in the room were transfixed by the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor. The lawyer, who, by the way, was my uncle, my grandparents' son, let the silence hang for a few more seconds. If we could read the minds of the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor, we'd learn the story hidden behind their facial expressions. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few kilometers from Big White Church. They organized a food and clothing bank, programs to help foster children, delivered prepared meals to elderly people confined to their homes, provided legal assistance, and offered other social services. A long time ago, Big White Church, which was and remains 100% white, provided Black Charity with financial and other support for several years. But then a very bitter and scandalous split occurred, allegedly because Black Charity was engaged in social evangelism, whereas Big White Church preached true evangelism. Big White Church even filed a lawsuit demanding the return of some of the money, although the case was settled and virtually none of the money was actually returned. But this was the American South, and everyone knew the real reason why the white church had stopped supporting the Black Charity. They had gotten a bit too big for their boots and forgotten their place. My grandparents seriously considered leaving Big White Church at the time, but decided to stay and teach tolerance through their words and example. They understood they couldn't change everyone's minds, but they hoped to reach at least some of the young people in their white church and help break the vicious cycle of racism. Grandma often said, "My church is my mission field." We only understood the true depth of those words after her death. From then on, Grandma and Grandpa secretly sent part of their tithes to black charity every month. Most of our family members, including me, only found out about all this after the meeting was over. But the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor understood perfectly what Grandma was trying to tell them through her actions, which turned out to be far more eloquent than words. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, like Grandma and Grandpa, the pompous pastor and the jerk pastor, you would have understood everything.